So I encourage you, I want you just to imagine for a moment the idea of sitting around, a dinner with your family, maybe a campfire or something like that. Well, maybe not a campfire. That's horrible. Who wants to go camping? But sitting around and the child, the kid, whoever goes and says, "Mom, Dad, tell me about the day you met," or "Tell me about the day I was born." I mean, even if you haven't had that experience directly, I think we can really connect with the idea of something that's really primal, about wanting to know where we're from, puts us in a larger context, helps us understand maybe a little bit of meaning and purpose, why we are even exist. Maybe we tell the story to give some details, to give context. My mother-in-law is here, and it's every December 27th on my wife's birthday. She calls her and starts off the conversation with, "It was the coldest day of the year." As she begins to tell the story of Lisa's birth. And that, you share that detail for the sake of kind of putting in context, helping you be there in the moment. But really, as we tell these stories, there's a point. There's a point we're trying to get to help each other, to help us understand that there is something deeper than just the now. We started a series that we're calling Stories in Genesis, that we're taking some particular stories. We don't know how many these stories people know. We talked last week about how interaction with Bible, and just reading the Bible anytime outside of a Sunday morning, is down for those who live in America. And that was even measured as simple as 3 to 5 times a year. Do you open up your Bible? So we are encouraging people we're going to talk about a story on Sunday morning. We encourage you to take those bookmarks, take them home, and however you read, whether it's an actual book that's the Bible, or you do it on your phone or computer, or however you do it, and actually interact. And if you're willing to do that for the next 15 weeks that we tell these stories, you're 3 to 5 times beating the averages of what's happening in the United States. So encourage you to do that. And we are starting, obviously, with the idea of the beginning. And so let me just, as opposed to reading, because you're going to be doing that this week, we are looking in chapters 1 and 2, and we see the story of God who is building creation. And as he begins to do it, we see him go, and the Bible talks about it as being 6 days. And we first see him during those first 3 days separating stuff. He makes a distinction between light and dark. Separates it, makes a distinction between heaven and the waters. And you see that. Then we see between the waters and the land. He begins to form what is reality. There's the real focus on that, certainly on earth. We're not talking too much about the cosmos, but there is some of that. As stars are created, and we see more of the heavens being created as well. But then, after those days, he starts to fill these things, and he fills the air, and he fills the water, and he fills the land with vegetation. And of course, as the story goes, because the point was to talk about our birth in a lot of ways, we hear the advent of man as God creates mankind. He does so by pulling from the dirt. Matter of fact, the term Adam that you are used to hearing is in many ways just a play on things, because it sounds very much like the Hebrew word for dirt that Adam was built out of, and it is the word for humankind. So in many ways, that may be a better term in understanding Adam before Eve came along, is just understanding him as earthling, the one that came from the earth. And he's there, and we see God put him, as we go into the second chapter. The second chapter is this this cinematic cut scene that goes and centers in on what's happening here in this Garden of Eden. This paradise garden. And as he says, and he has Adam to do things, he wants you to tend the garden. There's this stuff going on, and he wants you to come name the animals. And as Adam begins to do that, there's something going on. He begins to recognize this isn't everything. And so God pulls from Adam's side this almost a separation, this splitting of Adam, and creates Eve. And Adam says, "This is it. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." Finally, I mean, there's this certain idea that it's certainly marriage, but it's community, and it's beautiful, and creation is amazing. Now, you may be familiar with that story. You may know the details, or when you read it this week, whether it's later today or throughout the week, this may be brand new to you. But I think we learn so much about God and reality and ourselves. And I just want to spend our time this morning talking about some of those details that we pick up just hearing this story, that maybe because it's so familiar, we don't even realize that it's true. And the first comes right from the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the first blank in your outline is that we understand that God is powerfully creative. Powerfully creative. The power inherent, obviously, in what God is doing is stunning. I mean, He is just speaking. He is making it. It just happens. Now, like I said, you may be familiar with the story, so that doesn't sound that crazy to you. You would have picked that out yourself, but you got to realize how absolutely unique that is in stories of our beginnings, whether ancient stories or modern stories. You see, if we look at like ancient creation myths, a lot of those fall into two categories. One is the category of just biology, that creation happened because there was some physical union between two different forces, like the Babylonian myth that Tiamat and Asper, the fresh water and the salt water, come together and have this kind of marital intermingling and create all the different gods that represent the different parts of the cosmos, including Kishar, who is the earth. And it comes from this biology just pre-exists. Reality just pre-exists, and it is what it is, and there's this inevitable thing that happens to make everything you see. That's one of the stories we tell. Another story we will tell is that it's a story of chaos and battle. That the story of maybe something like Ymir, the giant in Norse mythology, that the god destroy him and take his body apart, and the blood became the rivers and his body becomes the earth, and it's born of just that there are these forces at work and that fight, and it just happens that this one wins, and that's how things are that are. Now, I've said that I think our modern stories fall in those categories as well. And I want to make a distinction. I know I'm on dangerous ground when I sit there and I talk about the story that we tell ourselves scientifically. I am not suggesting at all that the science is wrong, but the science itself doesn't say anything. The science is supposed to have these facts, and we put these facts together, and then as we begin to tell these stories. So, for example, there is the nature just exists story. When the scientists, especially here in the United States, began to postulate and got more and more popular the idea that there was a Big Bang, that there was a beginning to the universe. One of the major opponents of that, the Soviet Union, they had their scientists pushing hard to talk about a theory that they called solid state universe. That everything existed, because they really didn't like the idea that the universe had a beginning, because that sounded way too Christian. That sounded way too faith-based. And so they hated that idea. So they're just saying everything has always existed, and everything is, and this is just the natural movement of the inevitable movement, almost like a biological reality, that just what is out there. But I don't know that the Soviets needed to worry as much about the narrative, because what has become popular here in our modern culture is that the story of the Big Bang and the story of Earth, that again, it's not just the fact that it had a beginning, but when they begin to ask, like, well, how did that beginning happen? A proper scientist would say, well, we don't know. We don't know. Like, by definition, there's no precursor to that. We can't see any precursor. There's no movement. We don't know. But we begin to tell ourselves a story that, oh, well, it's just these random forces. These random forces, and it's this chaos, and the gases and the atoms, and as they collide and fight and create, and we are who we are. There's all this just random chance. Aren't we lucky that we won and are the top of the food pyramid on this planet? Those are the stories we tell ourselves, but the story here of God being powerfully creative is that He just wills it. He's not having to fight any forces. He doesn't have any opponents. It's not like, there's this water that is God, and he has to convince it to do one thing. It's like, no, there is one God who decides and makes and wills and speaks and says, let there be light, and there was light. To say, let this happen, and it happened. And it's not only the power, it's the creativity. He begins to separate and to fill, and he's building something. We see him building systems. He puts vegetation and says, now I want there to be seeds because there's going to be growth and this whole cycle of things that happen, and this is what I long for. And he builds it as somebody who's entirely creative. And it's good. Which really leads us into our next point, that we begin to understand something about reality, and that is, frankly, that reality is good. We see that over and over, that line. I appreciate the worship team reading the one from the sixth day, but there's some version of that on almost all the other ones before it. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning on the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. That term good in Hebrew is, it's probably not too different for us. We use the term good in a whole variety of ways. And there are at least 4 specific ways and things that are really denoted about the goodness of reality. One of the ways to understand good, and I have it as a blank to say good and complete, because I didn't know how to make it fit grammatically with the others, but in one sense, goodness is that it's complete, that God, he did what he wanted to do. He finished it. Well, sort of finished it. So it says, in the beginning, God created. That verb created, we don't have this tense in English. We have past tense, we have future tense, but in the verb in Hebrew, as I'm led to understand, that it means to kind of started something in the past and continues it. So it's not to say creation is completely finished. There is this creative aspect that continues, that it started and continued at least for some time. But it is to say completed in the sense that at least at this stage it is everything that it needed to be. I don't know, maybe one of the best examples I can think of is the idea maybe if you were to create a table, you were to build a table. And you built this table and it was complete, and you sat back and go, that's good. And it's complete. Now, it doesn't really mean all the uses of the table are gone. You're going to do other things at that table. Maybe it's going to be a place of gathering. Maybe you're going to put stuff on top of it and store stuff. Maybe, you just throw your dirty laundry. I don't know, whatever it might be that you do with a table, like there's still stuff that's going to happen, creative things that are going to happen, but that part of it is complete. So in one sense, that's what it means, that it's good and complete. But another is that it is aesthetically good, that it's beautiful. Man, I don't know what you think about this. Like, I hear people all the time. My wife likes to go hiking, and we've talked about that before, how only dumb people like to do that. But she claims, I got some bad looks on that one. Okay. But I'm like, why? If you want to walk, just go out the front door. But she goes, no, but it's really beautiful in these places we go. And that idea of beauty is certainly, you look at nature and you can find really beautiful things. My kids are spoiled when they went to school, and in their backyard is they're at Deep Creek, Damascus, and just across the soccer field, you see the glory of Mount Hood. It's unencumbered. It's beautiful. But I'm talking about more than that. Where do you think you even get the idea that something can be beautiful? Like, we don't see that in nature anywhere else. The idea of real beauty. And certainly we have different ideas, but that search for beauty that we look at, where does that come from? I have a friend who would describe himself as agnostic. And as I talk to him, he tells me how when he is listening to Beethoven, he will weep. And I tell him, I think you're tying in to something that God himself created, the aesthetics idea of beauty, that you are hearing something, you are experiencing something that is built into creation. And he goes, I don't think you get it, Bill. And I'm like, oh, that's all right. You'll get there. But you see, That idea as part of creation is this, that things can be beautiful. It also means the idea of morally good. You know, that things are good, and that creation as it's built, as it's described in Genesis 1 and 2, everything is where it's supposed to be. Everything is in proper perspective in its relationship with God, its relationship with others. You know, you've got people at one level, and you've got fish and animals down here, and you've got everything where it's supposed to be, in order where it's supposed to be. Everything is morally ordered. It is good. It isn't just random. It isn't just, it is what it is. I mean, think about that. The idea of ought, the way things ought to be, how do you possibly get to a place of saying anything should be unless there is a designer, a creator who has put the stamp and says, this is good. It's as it should be. And then he also means it purposefully. There is a purposefulness. There's a reason for this, for reality and the things that we experience. Like we experience it in some ways, and maybe there are multiple reasons. Like he mentions how he has the sun and the moon, he calls it the light of day and the light at night, the smaller light. And it's one of the uses and purposes of that is we are going to be able to tell time and create things like days and seconds and understand. And we still do. We have our calendar based on the sun, and we have cycles based on the moon. We understand these things, and we do that. Now, does that mean that's the only reason the sun and the moon exist? But it's to say God has a purpose, and he had that idea in mind as well. I often joke, but it's one of those jokes that I'm serious about, that God had me in mind when he made strawberries. Like, I think it's the best fruit ever, ever. And I am convinced that God at the beginning of the time says, oh, there's a lot of reasons, like we need to feed people, we need that, but Bill is really going to like this. I'm absolutely convinced that he has, he's saying he has a purpose. And what's really interesting, you're going to see this, because if you know the story in Genesis 3, we're going to get there, he has this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it mentions there, and it must be there for a purpose as well. I encourage you to read that as you begin to see and imagine. But realize we've learned something about God. He's powerful, he's creative. We learned something about reality. We learned something about ourselves. And the first is that we are creatures of God. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Literally, creatures. We are created ones. That God, in all the things about reality, that we're made to be complete and aesthetic and moral and purposeful, that is us as well. We are part of that creation. You and I were built for a purpose, and we have meaning. And there's a reason why we exist. In our modern world, that's hard to hear. You know, we feel voiceless. We scream against the darkness of the forces that are arrayed against us. That if we could just get everybody else to cooperate and do the right thing, then things would finally be good. And we imagine that, and yet we feel so powerless, so much of what's going on. But to realize we are part of a creation that God has made and said is good. Let me think of it this way. When we had those ice storms a few months back in January, remember, power was out for tens of thousands, 100,000 people in the Portland area. I mean, it was huge. We lost power at our house for days. I mean, and that meant no Wi-Fi. I mean, it was miserable. I didn't know how to live. But as we're doing without this and we're living and you see the power of ice and wind as things are going, and think, wow, we are just pawns against Mother Nature. The power of what's going on. And of course, we don't realize literally that there's a Mother Nature, but we say that, and we see her as a mother that is somehow this force to be. And I came across this quote. May surprise you, I've been reading about C.S. Lewis. And this quote that he talked about in a book, in a series called Living on an Atomic Age. And he mentions how, okay, if we look at ourselves as in this miserable, messed up part of nature, and we're actually at war with nature, he says, how did we get in this cage of this fight with Mother Nature? But he goes on to say, I'm just going to jump ahead. Mistaken for our mother, she is terrifying and even abominable. But if she is only our sister, if she and we have a common creator, if she is our sparring partner, then the situation is quite tolerable. Do you realize, at least in some spiritual sense, at best, nature hopes to be a sister with you, not your ruler? God created us. That was the pad there in 127. He created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created. That really, as the story unfolds, we realize that we were created at a whole different level, though. It's not that we alone have this image of God. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of speculation. I remember Aquinas arguing, well, it's about our reason, and others that. But the thing is it's not real clear. But what seems to be really clear is that there is this shared bond that God put in us, that we are connected to him in ways that the rest of creation doesn't seem to be at all. There is this bond, this connection, this level of rising that God has put us on, that we are just connected to God. Not divine by any means. It's not that we are gods. It doesn't say God created us as gods or that we will one day be gods, but that something about who he is, he has put into us. And we are bonded in a powerful way. That means, if nothing else, you realize your life has meaning and purpose. I know you have a world, and you have people, and you have an internet that's telling you that's not true. There was an article in Psychology Today a couple years ago that literally just asked the question, are you having an existential crisis? And it describes that struggle this way. An existential crisis is when a person questions their existence and the meaning of their life. And this can be a frightening experience as one can feel completely alone and lost in a seemingly random and meaningless universe. It's not random. It's not meaningless. You are not alone. Means a couple of other things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this next one. I sure wish I could. We're kind of hitting up to a limit, but I want to suggest to you that of some of the things we have to do, and that's it, literally the next blank in your outline if you want to follow along, is we have things to do. Genesis 1:28 says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. This idea of that it's our job to rule the earth, and not like a bad ruler who just says, it's mine, I can do what I want to, but a good ruler who is a steward of the earth, that we do have a responsibility for how our planet operates and how we work at it. You know, we live in Portland, right? We know there are a number of folks that really want to push the idea that we need to care about the environment and climate change and these kind of things. And as I talk to some of these people, like, for those who don't believe in God, for those who don't have a relationship with God, I don't know how intellectually they even get there. I mean, nobody says the rocks are somehow responsible to take care of the earth, or, you know, beavers, when they create dams and destroy the ecosystem around them, that somehow there's something good or evil about what they're doing. But to suggest that we have a responsibility to care, I don't know how you get there. But as Christians, clearly we do. As Christians, God says you have a responsibility. Now, how that works out and how we balance that as good rulers, that's up for grabs. I don't entirely know, but realize that that's one of the things that God had for us. Another thing that I found, this would be a total rabbit trail, so I can't spend too much on it, but in Genesis 2:19 says, the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals, all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. One of the things that there's this myth in our culture, our modern, postmodern myths, that reality is determined by what I feel. If I really want to know what's true, regardless of biology, regardless of reality, I just look inside, and whatever it is that I feel, that's what's true. It's my truth and true for me. But notice what God is doing here. God created the animals. He created them separately and says your job is just to recognize, classify, name what is true and real. It's already real. It's already objectively. There is this thing called a donkey. And I don't know if it's literally a donkey there, but whatever. Like there's this thing, and you can name it, and you can classify it, and this whole pursuit of taxonomy and by extension science. I mean, really isn't science us just looking and trying to discover and find out what it is that God has done and made, and just our sense of adventure. In all fairness to Lisa, when she wants to go hiking, I think she's living that adventure and seeing and knowing and living out the reality of what this is calling us to. We're not creating reality. We see it, we recognize it, we classify it. My rabbit trails. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, lastly, we are made for relationship. So we see all the animals, and it's really interesting the way chapter 2 does, that God says, yeah, I'm going to do something else here, but I need Adam to understand what I'm doing. So that's when he names all the animals, and then Adam recognizes there's nobody here that's really for me. Like, I mean, this is great. Eden's awesome. What you've created is awesome. All this is good, God, but I feel like I'm built for something else. And God is like, yep, here it comes. And he literally pulls him apart. And so he's no longer earthling. He is man and woman, Adam and Eve. And at some level, of course, that's marriage. But at another level, it's just community. It's not good for us to be alone. Adam cries out, or the man cries out, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman, for she was taken out of me. I think the call in there is certainly, I think there's something beautiful about the fact that the Bible starts with a wedding and ends with a wedding. That's absolutely cool. But realize in some ways, I think what Adam is screaming out, he's going, I found my people. You realize you were made to find your people, to be in connection and community and relationship. You can't be everything as God wanted you to be, alone, by yourself, ruling the earth and subduing and whatever. That we are made in part for one another. So much so, I pointed out Tim Keller a number of times when he said, you know, we all say we long for community until we find out it involves vulnerability and accountability. Why don't we want vulnerability and accountability? Because we don't measure up. We're embarrassed and ashamed, but that's not what we were supposed to be. Adam and his wife were both naked and felt no shame. That fully exposed, fully known, fully seen, without shame, without embarrassment. We just are present and connected and in community and relationship with one another, with God. Tell me to my face that you don't, in your inner spirit, long for that. I mean, everybody I've ever talked to, everyone I ever say, believer or otherwise, and I say, is this world the way it ought to be? I have never heard anybody go, yep, it's great just as it is. We have this inner sense, no, I don't really belong. This isn't really how it is. I know, I just feel, I get a sense there's this reality that I am built for something different. I am built for this. I am built for Eden. I am built for relationship with others, with God. I am there to be vulnerable and open because it's okay without shame. I long for that, and yet I look at a world and I don't see how I could ever get there. Well, we're going to see why next week. We're going to look at that. But if nothing else, know that when things are finally set right, for those of us who have a relationship with Christ, that what He is going to bring us into is some form of this again, that you and I were built for. Let's pray. Lord, in a lot of ways, I have learned to give up hope. There are so many things that I want out of this world and out of other people and the way things I want to be, and it's not like that. And I've learned to just deal with disappointment. That My government is going to be everything it wants to be, and my neighborhood's not going to be everything I want it to be, and all the people around me, and frankly, Lord, even myself. And I've settled for far too little. And yet you seem to hint, no more, that there is something about reality and how you've built us and who you are that is the right connection. I don't know if Eden is ever possible again. If we're willing to read to the end, we find out that you do recreate the heavens and the earth as it's always supposed to have been. And you usher that into, and Lord, I want that with you. So forgive me. Forgive me of my shame and my doubt and my lack of hope. Forgive me for the ways that I contribute to making this less like Eden. I long for your forgiveness. Set me right. And I commit this day, whether for the first time or the billionth time, to just continue to live that out with you, to figure out what it is that you want and begin to do it. And if I fail, I come right back to this point again. Forgive me. Lead me on. I want this. In Jesus' name, amen.